The 16th century was a time of flourishing. The Renaissance was in full swing across the European continent. We'll start in Florence, picking up just at the dawn of the High Renaissance, really a culmination of earlier Renaissance development, and then expand to elsewhere in Europe to see their innovations, responses to other cultures, and dialogues between cultures. The Italian peninsula was home to a number of independent city-states. Cities like Florence, Siena, and Venice had emerged as centers of trade, cross-cultural interaction, industry, and the arts. Following the devastating Black Death of the mid-14th century, feudal societies with rigid class systems and peasants and serfs had reorganized themselves into urban cities bustling with activity and new jobs. Corporate associations called guilds developed, with groups of physicians and artists and all sorts of merchants, and they became the new middle class. And sometimes, like in 13th and 14th century Florence, they were the government. The social and political Renaissance had then begun. Looking back, merchants had acquired new social status ever since the commercial revolution of the High Middle Ages had transformed at least the central Italian economy from a feudal militaristic one where the currency was land to a commercial one where it was about money, credit, trade, and connection. Likewise, commercial centers like Bruges and later Antwerp emerged north of the Alps in what is now Belgium and the Netherlands, the Low Countries. And so, the economic renaissance had begun. In Florence, the cradle of the Renaissance, where it really began, scholars had developed a renewed interest in classical civilization, the ancient Greeks and Romans, and that was brought about by translations and rediscoveries of ancient philosophical texts, driving a movement that came to be known as Renaissance humanism, with its roots in literature. Poets like Petrarch and Boccaccio channeled their passion for antiquity into their writings. And they believed that European civilization had died ever since the 5th century fall of the Western Roman Empire, and a classical revival was needed to return to that glory. A rebirth was needed, and in French, the word for rebirth is Renaissance. The formal idea of the Renaissance was then born. Now, Petrarch's literary humanism would find its way into the visual arts at the dawn of the 15th century when the Florentine Filippo Brunelleschi, famous for designing the dome of the Florence Cathedral, which you see here, visited Rome, initially in despair after losing a competition, but ultimately in triumph with a newfound interest in Greco-Roman architecture, which he would incorporate into his own vocabulary. He would later devise a system of rules that we now call linear perspective, or how to draw three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. That became adopted by Florentine artists, and it really became the new standard for evaluating an artwork's quality and merit. Patronage of the arts peaked in Florence under the Medici family of bankers who revolutionized accounting and rose to power in the city not as official rulers, but as skilled politicians tugging strings behind the scenes. They supported art, they financed it, they commissioned it, and they desired to make Florence the cultural nexus of Europe. And that spurred a competition between city-states for cultural dominance. The artistic renaissance had thus begun, and by the late 15th and early 16th centuries, it's blossoming. In the 1460s, the bottega or workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio was among the busiest in Florence. It was a bustling studio with many pupils and associates, using assembly lines of production to satisfy the ever-growing demand for artwork. Art was commissioned by churches, government officials, merchants, noblemen, really all walks of life. They were made to commemorate an engagement, memorialize a loved one, celebrate a wedding, capture somebody's likeness, or most commonly, as an aid for devotion, for prayer in the home. This is a painting of the Madonna and Child, probably the most frequently depicted subject in Renaissance painting. It was the most simple traditional picture and made for an excellent devotional aid, an object to pray to. Madonna in Italian means My Lady, meaning the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ, and the infant on her lap is the Christ child. Being religious is by no means a requisite for viewing Renaissance artwork, because these artists are some of the best visual storytellers, and you can deduce what's happening in a work of art, oftentimes knowing only the very basics. Most of the common people at this time were actually illiterate. They were unable to read the Bible for themselves. So artwork allowed for the visual interpretation of biblical scenes. And in some sense, these works were instructional. Now, there are so many ways to approach this work alone. We can start from the historical context. Verrocchio was a highly celebrated painter during his lifetime, receiving the support of the Medici, the family who ruled Florence for a good chunk of the 15th century. And that prestige meant that Verrocchio and his workshop would have secured a number of lucrative, high-end commissions from affluent patrons, nobles, and bankers, and the like. This painting is of good size. It's almost a meter tall, so it's too large to be practically portable, to be carried around by a merchant, for example. It's not quite large enough to adorn any major altar in a church either, so it's more plausible that this was made for a domestic setting, for domestic devotion. We can now turn to a visual analysis, a direct visual description of the picture. This is a roughly pyramidal composition. We get the sense that the curtains on either side have just opened to reveal this very calm and touching scene, situated against an expansive landscape. Mary's soft downward gaze gives a sense of maternal love, while the flanking angels seem more nonchalant, very innocent, almost mischievous, adding a childish playfulness to the composition. The figures are quite individualistic. Look at the masterful rendering of the effects of natural light, the nuances of highlights and shadows on Mary's face, the attention to the anatomy of the neck, reflecting an increasing interest in anatomical precision. We see the same sensitivity to bone and structure in the hands of the Virgin and the leftmost angel, although not in the Christ child or the rightmost angel. Their hands are more clearly defined, heavier reliance on line for definition, rather than using very nuanced light effects to convey form. So it's thus thought that these are the contribution of an assistant, rather than being the master's own work, which would be the more graceful, nuanced hands lit by naturalistic light effects. And that practice of using educated looking to attribute or determine the authorship of an artwork is called connoisseurship, a pretentious name, I know. And there's an ongoing debate between the merits of connoisseurship versus the merits of scientific analysis, and I think it's fair to say that we need a fair bit of both. Now, Verrocchio was primarily a sculptor, so many of his paintings were collaborations where assistants would paint a good portion of a work and reserve only the most important figures for Verrocchio, and that's what we think we see here. This light, this natural light, shines in at an angle from the right, out of the frame, relative to our position. And that light may have echoed the real light source in the work's original context. There might have originally been a window to the upper right of the picture, letting in real natural light, complementing the naturalistic effects that Verrocchio has already included. And that suggests that this painting was placed in a private chapel adjoining a house, something that only the wealthiest of Florentines could afford. So we're looking at quite a high-end patron here. And so as you're looking at a work of art, I encourage you to think about its original context, to find information about that, because the context in which a work is displayed greatly informs your viewing. Nowadays, under museum lighting, often artificial lighting, we lose that context, and this applies especially to earlier gold-ground altarpieces, as well as domestic devotional works such as this. We often forget that these were mostly made for very dim environments, private altars or high altars, sometimes with a source of real natural light, as is likely in this case, or in the presence of candlelight, as in a cathedral. Iconographic analysis involves the examination of the symbols present in a work of art. One angel here holds a stalk of lilies whose white petals symbolize purity, an allusion to Mary's virginity. The star on Mary's shoulder is adorned with real gold leaf, essentially glued to the wooden panel with a binding agent, and it references an ancient name for her, the Star of the Sea. Parts of the lily in the figure's robes are also gilded with ornamental gold. We can also see the hint of a halo to indicate that we're looking at sacred figures here. Look at the gemstones on the brooches, rendered with incredible precision. It's absolutely exquisite, a testament to Verrocchio's experience as a master goldsmith in addition to master painter and sculptor. Many artists were trained in and worked across multiple media. Technical or scientific analysis has revealed that some of the golden portions of this work were not done with real gold leaf, but rather the yellow pigment tin sulfide that can be seen on the angel's robes. And the differences are quite subtle, but this type of pigment analysis would be done by taking a minuscule cross-section sample of paint, trapping it in a resin block, and then examining it under a microscope where you'd see all the layers of paint. Usually, pigments would be ground from minerals into a fine powder and then mixed with a binding agent like egg yolks or later natural oils like linseed. This painting was executed in tempera, which is an egg-based paint. That was the standard medium for Florentine paintings before 1500. And those pigments would typically be obtained from the apothecary, or the sort of chemist. Painters actually belonged to the guild of apothecaries. For the support, Verrocchio has used wooden panel, the standard support for paintings of this period, and he would have obtained that from the carpenter. Infrared reflectography of this work, done by shining rays on it to show the preparatory work or underdrawing below the paint surface, show that the heads of some figures here were transferred onto the panel by pouncing. Now, preparatory drawings or cartoons were often done for common figures, saints and angels for example, and incised at the outlines so that they were easily transferable onto a wooden panel for painting by tracing to save time. And that technique of transfer by tracing is called pouncing. And so what a massive amount of insight this single work gives us, not only into the context of its patronage, but also the working styles and techniques of the artist. All too often, we just walk past a Madonna and Child like this, and we forget that each and every one carries with it a fascinating backstory. So we've now scratched the surface of art historical analysis. It's incredibly multifaceted, multidisciplinary, and I hope to elucidate some of that and apply it to a wide variety of 16th century works in this series. Not only paintings, but also sculpture, decorative arts, textiles, prints, and architecture. Art history is very much about learning how to look and not about rote memorization of a collection of factoids. It's about finding works that have an emotional impact on you, that you can personally relate to, that have value for you. It's about analyzing artistic documentation, some of the best primary sources from the past, to learn about our present and about the human condition. The questions of value and function are paramount in art history. What does it mean for something to have value? Monetary or emotional or political value? Why do we assign value to objects, both devotional and decorative? Some Renaissance artists were certainly valued over others during their time, and now we value different artists. In fact, Botticelli, whose Birth of Venus you saw a while ago, was forgotten until I think the 19th century, when he became incredibly appreciated, and now he's one of the most celebrated Italian Renaissance artists. Tastes are ever evolving, and values ever changing. After all, subjectivity is inherent to the arts. But that means that we often have to take a step back and consider why the artwork was originally made, what sort of a emotional response was it designed to elicit. What made a work of art valued? At what echelons of society? Well, I think many artworks today are valued because they have the ability to exert an emotional impact and make you return to it again and again. That was certainly true in Renaissance times, especially with regard to devotional works designed to encourage piety and inspire faith, often using depictions of raw emotion. And it's powerful in that the raw emotion expressed in a work of art can be appreciated and felt by all, regardless of religious belief today. On a deeper level, values and functions often reflected changing times, social norms, political power, and propagandistic messaging. In many cases, artists and their work were valued by nobility and royalty for their ability to inspire reverence and submission and admiration in the beholder, reverence and submission and admiration for the patron. And analyzing the effects of an effective propagandistic picture is, I think, quite an important skill to have in an age of digital pictures. It's like analyzing visual rhetoric. I tend to think of artists as storytellers. Every artist is telling a visual story through their choice of materials, color, setting, subject, and iconography. A good work of art is like a good story. It makes you return to it. It makes you think about it constantly, to look at it more. Works of art draw you in and invite you to discover new things about it every time you look at it again, to make new connections every time you think about it again. Whether that's because of its subject matter, its visual impact, or its historical context. And in that sense, art can offer solace. It has the ability to slow down time, to make you lose yourself in its symbolism and detail and beauty. Art from 500 years ago can make modern people see differently. It teaches us invaluable analytical skills critical to so many fields that are difficult to acquire anywhere else. It makes you empathize and examine. And perhaps most importantly, it fosters curiosity and connection. It introduces you to the diversity of thinking, cultures, and values through ways of representation and through iconography. And that's why we study art history. That's the power and potential of a work of art. That is the meaning that a work of art can have. This series is intended to showcase some of those meanings and elucidate them in a 16th century context. And I hope, in looking at these great works of art, you can find your own meaning in them and in art history. I hope to see you in Chapter 1.